The Leafs have Jake Muzzin because of Phil Kessel. Sort of. Today's trade tree video is a huge one. We're going to be looking at the Boston Bruins trading Phil Kessel to the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Leafs trading Phil Kessel to the Pittsburgh Penguins. We're going to look at how the Bruins did, the Leafs did, the Penguins did, somehow how the Anaheim Ducks did, and yes, there is a little tidbit in there that led to the Leafs getting Jake Muzzin. Without further delay, may I introduce you to the fine work of intern Tom. Tom, can you show him that little thing that you made? Yeah, how long did this thing take? Somewhere between forever and an eternity, right? Holy cow. Looking at this all at once makes no sense and frankly makes me nauseous, so let's just start with where it began, with Toronto and Boston making a deal. The initial trade was Phil Kessel going from the Boston Bruins to the Toronto Maple Leafs in exchange for a 2010 first round pick, a 2010 second round pick, and a 2011 first round pick. A lot of Leaf fans don't look back on that deal exactly fondly, and that's because the Leafs gave up a lot. And a reminder that my current coworker Brian Burke is the one who made that trade since he was the GM of the Leafs at the time. But I do have a theory as to why Brian Burke made that trade. The Leafs sucked. The team had nobody even close to having star power on the team, and Phil Kessel brought star power. Actually, he had both star power and star in the making power. Being the 5th overall pick in 2006, Phil Kessel, in his third full season in the NHL, in 70 games, scored 36 goals and 60 points. And Jeremy Jacobs and the Boston Bruins didn't feel like paying him anymore. So Brian Burke said yoink, and he took him. Well, it wasn't quite that simple. There was talk about an offer sheet. The Leafs didn't quite have all the picks, and then they made trades in order to get some of their picks back so that they can make the threat of an offer sheet. The trade they eventually agreed on was 2 firsts and a second. It's all magic beans, right? What are the odds any of those guys turn into a player as good as Phil Kessel? Well, if the Leafs are really bad and they're both lottery picks, pretty good. Here's the thing about Phil Kessel, his end of the bargain, he met it. Kessel missed the first 12 games of the 2009-2010 season recovering from shoulder surgery. During his first game as a Toronto Maple Leaf on home ice, he gets destroyed by Matthias Ohlund with a giant open ice hit. However, Phil Kessel stayed in the game and stayed in every game since. He has not missed a single regular season game since 2009, 11 years ago. In those 70 games he played in his first year as a Leaf, he put up 30 goals and 25 assists for 55 points, coming off a shoulder surgery. And yes, those 55 points led the team. So did the 30 goals. The problem is the guy was on an island. Those 30 goals were tops on the Leafs. Second on the Leafs was Nicholas Hagman with 20. Kessel's 55 points were the highest on the Leafs as well. Thomas Caberlet was second with 49, but the second highest scoring forward on the Leafs, Alex Ponikarovsky, with just 41. With Phil Kessel still recovering from shoulder surgery, the Leafs went 0-7-1 to begin the season and were well on their way to being one of the league's worst teams. Funny enough, that's what ended up happening. They finished second last in the entire National Hockey League, 29th out of 30, and that first round pick in 2010 that the Leafs gave Boston ended up being second overall. That was the big Taylor versus Tyler draft. Taylor Hall versus Tyler Seguin. Who's going to go first? Well, it was Taylor Hall, and Tyler Seguin went second to the Boston Bruins. Looking back on it with hindsight, you could argue Seguin should have gone first. Getting back to Tyler Seguin in a second, the second round pick that the Leafs gave to the Bruins in that trade turned out to be Jared Knight. He didn't really pan out. He was flipped for former first rounder Zach Phillips. Phillips didn't really pan out. He was traded to the Blues for future considerations. Now, the Bruins still have the Leafs' 2011 first round pick, and the Leafs weren't much better. That pick ended up being 9th overall. Now I'm going to tell you a very quick story. The day of the 2011 draft, I was at a giant sports bar in Toronto called Real Sports, working for a different broadcaster covering the draft. In walks Tyler Seguin and then Leaf prospect Jesse Blacker, and I had interviewed both of them, so we said hello. Now it should be mentioned that Tyler looked very tired on account of he had just won the Stanley Cup with the Boston Bruins as a rookie in the 2011 Stanley Cup playoffs. Did I mention that? Did I mention that trade turned out pretty good for Boston? And it wasn't even done. Seguin politely asked me, hey, who do you want the Leafs to draft? And I said, well, I know it's a long shot, but there's this defenseman named Dougie Hamilton who I really like. He then went to sit down with his friend, and with the 9th overall pick, the Boston Bruins select Dougie Hamilton. In a deep state of depression, I put my head in my arms on the table. And that's when I felt a tap on my shoulder. And when I looked up, it was Tyler Seguin, smiling widely. He looked me in the eye and he said, "Thank you, Kessel," and then walked away. So for all of you still sending me tweets making fun of me because I cheer for a team that lost to a 42-year-old Zamboni driver who worked for them, that moment was worse. In the summer of 2009, the Leafs needed a star, and when they made this trade, they knew they were getting one. However, they gave up 2 to make it. And one of those stars was on the Bruins when they won the Cup in 2011, not to mention that the Leafs also gave the Bruins Thomas Kaberle for that Cup run. Now, it should be worth mentioning that the Boston Bruins traded both Tyler Seguin and Dougie Hamilton. I don't think they did great in the trades. A lot of people don't think they did great in the trades, but this is worth mentioning too. Before Dougie Hamilton was traded, he played 178 games for the Boston Bruins. That's not nothing. Before Tyler Seguin was traded, he played 203 games as a Boston Bruin and won a Stanley Cup. Also not nothing. So even though the trades sending those 2 players out of town weren't that great, the Bruins still got about 400 game service out of 2 players. Now quickly, here are the trades that sent them out of town. Tyler Seguin was traded to the Dallas Stars along with Rich Peverley and Ryan Button in exchange for Riley Smith, Louis Eriksson, Joe Morrow, and Matt Frazier. That's a pretty great example of if you're giving up the best player in a trade, you're gonna lose. Louis Eriksson spent 3 seasons as a Bruin and was largely a disappointment. He was widely considered as one of the most underrated players in the National Hockey League as a member of the Dallas Stars. With the Bruins, he wasn't able to recapture that until his 3rd and final season as a Bruin when he put up 30 goals and over 60 points. He used that production to sign a giant deal with the Vancouver Canucks that has since... well, I'm sure you've heard. He hasn't hit 30 points as a Canuck yet, and honestly, I don't think he's gonna. Riley Smith wasn't bad, but he hadn't quite broken into the player that we know him as today. He was packaged along with Mark Savard's contract and sent to the Florida Panthers in exchange for former Leafs second-rounder Jimmy Hayes. The Panthers later sent Riley Smith along with Jonathan Marchessault to Vegas in what is now known as a pretty terrible trade. But Riley Smith, Louis Eriksson, Joe Morrow, Matt Frazier, none of them with the impact that Tyler Seguin has had on the Dallas Stars. The Dougie Hamilton one is a little different. Dougie Hamilton was traded to the Calgary Flames in exchange for a first-rounder in 2015 and 2 second-rounders in 2015. Those 3 players turned into Zachary Senyshyn, Jakob Forsbacka-Karlsson, and Jeremy Lauzon. All 3 of them have played in the NHL for the Boston Bruins, but their total combined games played in the NHL for Boston is less than 100 games. That's not exactly great value for Dougie Hamilton, but it should be mentioned that they're all 23 years old. Actually, Lauzon, I think, isn't even 23 yet. He's still 22. Now, on the other end of it, how did Phil Kessel do as a member of the Toronto Maple Leafs? It's up in the air. It depends who you ask. Not the greatest defensive player, regarded as a bit of a pain, but he played 446 games, put up 394 points, 181 of them goals for a team that was bad and couldn't score. Whose fault is that? They only made the playoffs once, but it was fun. Until it wasn't. Then the new era begins in Toronto. Shanahan's there, Babcock, and Lou Lamoriello was there as well. And they decide, all right, we're gonna burn it to ash, we're gonna get rid of any players of any value, and we're gonna get futures in exchange, hence Phil Kessel getting traded to the Pittsburgh Penguins. Here was the deal. The Pittsburgh Penguins received Phil Kessel, obviously, plus defenseman Tim Eriksson, Tyler Biggs, remember that guy? And a 2nd-round pick in 2016. In exchange for Kessel, the Leafs received former 1st-round pick Kasperi Kapanen, still a prospect at the time, a 3rd-round pick in 2016, defender Scott Harrington, forward Nick Spaulding, and a 1st-round pick in 2016. To save you the suspense, the 3rd-round pick in 2016 that the Leafs got in that deal was used on J.D. Greenway. They got the wrong Greenway. He didn't really pan out. Jordan Greenway is doing great for the Minnesota Wild. Scott Harrington had an injury-marred time at the Toronto Maple Leafs, bit unfortunate. He was traded to Columbus for former 1st-round pick Kirby Reichel, who was later packaged with Renat Valiev and a 2nd-round pick in 2018 so that the Leafs could get Thomas Plekanec at the 2018 trade deadline, where they lost to Boston. Again. Now this next part is weird. You're gonna have to pay attention. We'll start with the 2016 first rounder that the Penguins gave the Leafs in this trade, okay? You see, the Pittsburgh Penguins, along with Phil Kessel, won the Stanley Cup in 2016, therefore making Phil Kessel a Stanley Cup champion, and also therefore making that 1st round pick 30th overall. The Leafs flipped that 2016 first round pick to the Anaheim Ducks along with a 2017 second rounder for Frederik Andersen. Now, I don't know about you, but I was really worried about this trade at the time on account of the Leafs traded a bunch of futures for a former backup from a California team who was on an expiring contract. And the last two times the Leafs had tried that were Jonathan Bernier with the LA Kings and Vesa Toskala with the San Jose Sharks. You want to tell me how those went? How those did? Were they good? No. Steve, just tell me who the Ducks pick with those picks is going to be bad? Oh, well, yeah, kind of. The 2016 first round pick that the Leafs gave the Ducks in exchange for Frederik Andersen turned into Sam Steele, who hasn't really broken out in the NHL yet, but he does already have a career hat trick. What about the second rounder? Well, actually, it's tied to another part of that trade. Remember forward Nick Spaulding? Yep, there he is. He was sent, along with defender Roman Polak, to the San Jose Sharks in exchange for Raffi Torres, well, basically Raffi Torres' contract, a 2017 second rounder, and a 2018 second rounder. Here's how those two trades connect. The 2017 second rounder that the Leafs gave the Ducks in the Frederik Andersen trade is the one they got from the San Jose Sharks for Roman Polak and Nick Spaulding. And that second round pick turned into another player who has played in the NHL for the Anaheim Ducks, Maxime Comtois, who was actually the captain of Canada's World Junior team. So in exchange for Frederik Andersen, the Ducks got Sam Steele and Maxime Comtois, and they still have John Gibson in net. Not bad. Steve, you kept mentioning Jake Muzzin off the top. What were you talking about? Let me tell you. With the 2018 second round pick that the Leafs got from the San Jose Sharks in exchange for Roman Polak and Nick Spaulding, the Leafs selected defenseman Sean Durzi. The Leafs then traded Durzi along with prospect forward Carl Grundstrom and a second round pick to the LA Kings in exchange for Jake Muzzin. Now, I'm gonna throw a little asterisk on that. I'm gonna pretend that trade is the Houston Astros. I said it, they cheated. Shut it, stop, they cheated. But that's another sport that we're not playing right now. Just, here, stop, I'm almost done. The reason I say the Phil Kessel trade didn't lead to the Jake Muzzin trade is because Nick Spaulding was not the principal piece of the deal going to the Sharks. It was Roman Polak. He's the one who had the lion's share of the value in that trade. Spaulding was kind of like a cap dump throw-in. What are you talking about? That guy played in 24 playoff games for the Sharks that year. Yeah, and put up 1 assist. Although, worth mentioning, another Phil Kessel trade where the Leafs helped a team make it to the Stanley Cup final. So, if you watched the last trade tree video where I talked about Chris Pronger going from the Edmonton Oilers to the Anaheim Ducks, it's not like a third round pick allowed the Oilers to get Oscar Klefbom. It was part of the deal, but not the principal part of the deal. In the same way that Nick Spaulding was part of the deal that got the Leafs 2 second-round picks here from San Jose, but he wasn't the principal part of the deal. As for Kasperi Kapanen, how haven't I talked about him yet? He has already played in 202 career NHL games for the Leafs, not bad for a 23-year-old, and put up 90 points. Yeah, they've had to suspend him for some shenanigans, but he already has a 20-goal season under his belt. He's a key penalty killer for the team, and he's one of the fastest straightaway players in the league. He's a lot of fun to watch. And trading that first-round pick away in the Frederik Andersen deal, can you imagine what the Leafs would have looked like if they didn't have Frederik Andersen the past 4 seasons? They would have just been tying Curtis McElhinney to the crossbar like Millhouse. Now, folks, we've put quite enough time into this trade tree, so let's put a bow on it. Kessel's tenure in Pittsburgh started out a little rocky. They were barely making the playoffs, and then they fired their coach and then brought in Mike Sullivan and promptly won 2 Stanley Cups. Phil Kessel put up 303 points in 328 regular season games as a Penguin. He put up 56 points, 20 of them goals, in 65 playoff games as a Penguin. 22 points in 24 games the first season the Penguins won the Cup, and 23 points in 25 games the second season the Penguins won the Cup. He was an integral part of that team. And in his best regular season as a Pittsburgh Penguin, with 34 goals and 92 points, Phil Kessel was always a criminally underrated playmaker. The Penguins didn't even win the Cup that year. The guy then put up 82 points in 82 games with the Penguins and then was traded to Arizona, where it hasn't been as sunny, but man, He was a monster as a Penguin. The Pens traded Kessel to the Arizona Coyotes in exchange for Pierre-Olivier Joseph and Alex Galchenyuk. Now you want to talk about Phil Kessel not panning out in Arizona? Galchenyuk didn't do so in Pittsburgh either. But then Galchenyuk was packaged with prospect Kalen Addison and a first-round pick in 2020 and sent to the Minnesota Wild in exchange for Jason Zucker. You want to talk about people the delay in this NHL season has hurt the most. Jason Zucker had 6 goals and 12 points in 15 games with the Penguins. He was playing with Sidney Crosby. That guy should be in Halifax right now, standing outside of Sidney Crosby's house with a boombox. So, what's the lesson here? If you look at the first 2 trades, Kessel to Toronto and then Kessel to Pittsburgh, I think I can tell you. Phil Kessel is not necessarily a player that you build an entire team around. However, that doesn't mean that Phil Kessel is not or was not an incredible player. The Leafs seem to think Phil Kessel was a cornerstone and maybe that they were a little bit better than they were. And they weren't. And he wasn't. The Penguins thought, hey, we already have Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin and they're pretty sick. Let's add Phil Kessel to that and laugh all the way to back-to-back cups. And they did. So it's just funny. The Leafs are in the middle of this little Phil Kessel trade sandwich with 2 teams that wear black and yellow and 1 Stanley Cups. And then there's them. You know, just being the Leafs. So, that was a long one. What'd you think? Let me know in the comment box down below. Shout out producer Drew. Shout out intern Tom. Holy cow. Welcome to my nightmare. These are hard, right? Yeah, they were hard writing them. And I hope that was both entertaining for you and informative. But for now, that is it for this trade tree. Thank you very much for watching. Click like if you like this video. Click subscribe if you really liked it. Tell all your friends. And stick around, man. I know there aren't a lot of sports going on right now, but Sportsnet's YouTube channel is packed. Check it out.